Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to see you all here, and it's my pleasure to chair this first opening panel for the AI Symposium today. We're going to hear from three speakers, and I'll introduce them all up front, and we will follow the order of this little brochure here because there are some people coming in online. I'll remind you at the end, but when we have time for questions, we'll ask you to also use microphones so that your words of wisdom can be communicated to the world. So this panel is on AI as language, technology, and the posthuman, and we're going to cogitate around themes in relation to AI and translation programs, what AI is doing to language, and how perhaps that situation is kind of reframing the situation of the human and creating new contexts for the posthuman. We're going to hear from three speakers from different perspectives on this. The first one is Professor Tom Lucer, who's a Professor of East Asian Studies at New York University. His areas of research include cultural anthropology and Japanese studies, art, architecture and urban forms, new media studies, animation and critical theory. Our second speaker, who will be coming on remote from Zoom, is Jonathan E. Abel, Professor of Comparative Literature and Asian Studies at Penn State University. His work delves into the conduits for and obstacles to the cycles of production, circulation, and reception of culture. Abel's recent book, The New Real, is about mimesis in the history of new media. And our third speaker, who's also at the table here, Nick Montfort, developed computational poetry and art, often collaboratively. He is Professor of Digital Media at MIT and Principal Investigator in the Center for Digital Narratives at the University of Bergen, Norway. His lab or studio, the Trope Tank, has locations in New York City and at MIT. And we welcome our three speakers today. We'll hear from all of the speakers in turn, and then we'll open it up for questions and discussion at the end of the presentation. So,
quick but sincere thanks to Helen Coe for all the organizing and Peter Eckersall as well. And then John and Nick for agreeing to join this panel. I want to begin with some simple or crude generalizations, really simple ones, in hope that being simplistic might actually help to frame some really basic questions that maybe don't always get asked about AI. And you'll see I'm actually not exactly going to talk about AI, just to set the expectations low. To start with, AI is above all technology of language. And language has itself always been a technology, maybe our most basic technology. In some ways, I think you could say, at least implicitly, one of the most important claims about AI is that it's a language that speaks in and for itself. Or in other words, the claim is that an AI is a language that has sufficiently divorced itself from us that it's now an agency on its own. It is its own agency, and though purely a language, it's not some other thing's language. It's its own language. It's just a language that speaks on its own, which sounds weird, but for the moment. So it can speak, create, and author things independently of us and of our agencies, maybe even speak against us and in opposition to what we think. So maybe it's worth taking those obvious points seriously and ask, what would that agency look like? If, as an anthropologist has always told us, language equals culture, what would the culture of an AI be, or what would it look like? And if language provides a world, what might an AI's world look like? And still more basically, if language gets tied to specific cultures, even in the most simple material ways, as in the difference between, say, a Chinese character and Latin alphabets, what might we say about the materiality of AI letters or AI writing? So I think others will talk about the creative potentials, perhaps the idea of authorship, but I'd like to focus more simply on AI language, and including its material form, to think about what that might tell us about the direction that AI seems to be pushing us as humans. To be clear, in fact, I'm not always really going to talk about AI. As I said, I'm more interested in the general context of contemporary AI and computer language more generally, so that I can put it in context with the directions our lives now seem to be taking. For me, AI is still very much a means of talking about ourselves, even if I'm starting with this conceit that an AI might be thought of independently. and that it's helpful to do that. Also, I really want to talk about the way artists are framing all of this, but to start with some obvious technical points. For the most part, you might say that computer languages in general claim to their own kind of universality. All, of course, reduced to ones and zeros, so at its material roots, computer language has greater claim to universality and global sameness than any other language. In practice, writing most non-Latin languages, again, like Chinese or Japanese, on a computer is usually mediated by Latin letters. Think of the keyboard. You can't get from the computer code to Chinese without typing Latin letters. And this inevitably attaches to some kind of cultural and historical meaning. And you can see kind of a practical hierarchy in the lettering. You can't get from the universal computer code to the local Chinese or Japanese or whatever without going through the almost universal Latin. But I wouldn't make too much of that. And it might be also worth noting that the act of writing computer code may seem to be universal, but there are, of course, hundreds of languages for writing computer programs, and these do vary to some extent by region. There is regionality. But there really isn't a strong tie between any specific computer programming language to a specific culture or worldview. So it's probably fair to say that in its heart, computer language seems to be very generic and generically universal. At least at the level of technology, computerized language can be viewed as non-culturally specific, a non-culturally specific way of talking about things. Whether it ties to its own specific world is a little harder to say. I think there's also a deeper history to this kind of language, tying early sacred languages like Latin to mathematical languages that arguably could be compared with contemporary computer languages, but I'm not going to go into that today, I don't have time. To these somewhat crude generalizations about the material conditions of computer-based writing and language, we might also add that if an AI is somehow thought to be truly generative of language, in principle, it's a being that does not really have affect, emotion, or desire. These latter terms are now subject to some debate, but in principle, an AI doesn't start with these relations to language. Also, there's a technical indistinction between fact and fiction, as we know. That's why you get terms like hallucination for AI. There are some general starting points to keep, these are general points to keep in mind. If taken by themselves, they would seem almost like examples of a non-human mode of language. But I want to turn now to some actual usages and perceptions that surround computer-based language relations to suggest something like a practical landscape of computer-based writing and language. This is closer to what might be called the imaginary that we attach to contemporary AI languages. And for this, I'm going to just focus on Asia and recently on recent work by the global/Chinese artist Xu Bing and a couple of things from Japan. So let me start with a brief image or set of images. These are from the Japanese consortium called DumType, a group that's sometimes itself called a system as much as a group of people, and their Japan Pavilion exhibit at the last Venice Biennale. The show included a set of mirrors set at the 4 cardinal directions, spinning and reflectively projecting digitized words onto the walls, or sometimes just a line of light that they called a horizon. At the same time, rotating parametric speakers similarly projected spoken words towards the walls that would occasionally blur into an atmosphere of light or of dots. At the center of the room, though, was an almost empty space. Most of the words and sentences appeared to be random, but they were citations from one of the first textbooks of world geography from the 1850s. They were posed mostly as questions that DumType says are simple but universal. Things like, what is a river? So just to start, it would seem that for DumType, there is reason to go back to some basics about how we think about the world itself considered as a geography that we thought we knew maybe, but maybe don't anymore. The project is titled Remap. But there's also a tremendous uncertainty here. Everything's mediated by mirrors, speakers, light, and especially by language. There's never even a picture of something like a river. And these different materialities of mediation themselves don't seem stable. The line of words projected on the walls is described occasionally as a horizon, but that doesn't really hold. And the center of the room from which maybe you could or are supposed to be able to see everything is described as a void or a nothing, a nowhere that could be anywhere. But in the entryway, there's also these clear vinyl recordings with the voices of classic ethnographers talking about specific cultures located in traditional places around the globe. It's almost a trite use of analog technology and representational language to describe a world geography, a logic of cultural divisions that we've traditionally lived by, but maybe that no longer holds true. So if this is somehow meant to indicate the elements that make up our geography and mediate our world, it's complicated. Obviously, digital technologies are part of the mediation as is projection, but it's really hard to see what a knowing subject might be if the center, the place from which we see and read everything, is really a void. It's not a classic landscape. If this is what posthumanism is, maybe it's not so happy. And I'll also just note that language itself is really important, but increasingly it starts to look like language itself is nothing more than a medium, just a medium, and not a tool of communication. That's one way of starting to think about language and the landscape or geography of the contemporary human subject under at least computerized terms. But for a fuller set of examples, I want to turn to the Chinese artist Xu Bing. He spent a career working with the materiality of written language, and more recently has also been toying with something like a geography of language. I'll start with a work he created while stuck in New York during COVID for 3 years, pretty much confined to his computer. So it's literally a digital form for a digital world from a time when he apparently felt the logic of the external world was even more intensely falling apart. The title is Gravitational Arena, that again indicates something about the most basic rules of the earth are at stake, like gravity. It has much of the kind of content that Xu Bing is known for, including his own invented Chinese characters put into material form and now arranged into a vortex, what he calls a whirlpool of characters, that in principle extends out beyond the roof of the museum, putting aside the fact that these are invented characters and so in most ways illegible. They look like Chinese, but they're not. The thing that most interested me about this was that Xu Bing said there is, in fact, an ideal position from which to read this vortex of writing, that it could somehow actually be seen and read, although that ideal position is somewhere above the museum itself, where nobody could actually be. So I just keep thinking, what is that spectatorial position here that's supposed to make sense of the world and give it order? It's a transcendent place, but only sort of. If it were a classic humanist subject position, it should be the location of anybody human, but it's not. Maybe this is an indicator of a return to the divine, but it doesn't seem to be that kind of transcendence, and it's not really even the position of the artist himself as a kind of harbinger of a new world. It doesn't seem to be the position of humans at all, as we've known them, but not maybe AI either, although that it does seem to be part of a new digital infrastructure. To just push it a little bit further, why a vortex? Why a whirlpool? Xu Bing noted that this entails stretching a 2D surface of writing into a kind of 3D space. So it's a space of meaning, sort of, a space of language that's really a non-signifying language because you can't read the characters because they're not real. And we know that it entails some kind of transformation of the logic of space. As with language, gravity too still operates, but it's not just gravity in the traditional format. Maybe there's a new grammar, or at least a new mode of linguistic communication that works according to the logic of a vortex. How would that work? And again, what kind of position is it that can read language arranged into a vortex? Does meaning itself coalesce according to a different logic? So maybe this is a radically new organization of language and matter that in fact none of us can make sense of. I don't think that's the case, but the main point for the moment is that in both the first and second example, there actually is a central spectatorial position, maybe the position of a reader, but we are not in it. This doesn't necessarily imply simple disorientation, but it does indicate the possibility of a world that does coalesce differently than we've had, and a subject that therefore is organized differently as well. Again, perhaps we should consider the real subject position of the vortex to be that of an AI subject, the one that speaks itself. Anyway, we're being positioned through the medium of language. Let me continue. Anyway, to go back to Schubing's work, much of his recent career has straddled seemingly opposite ideas. Opposite ideas of both the linguistic side and of artistic work more generally. On the one hand, none of his ideograms are real. None of them carry any meaning or can be read, so they're not really even signs at all. And the same might be said of his recent painting and artwork. The painting is reduced to its pure materiality. And so this is a painting of a traditional Chinese landscape. If you look from the other side of it, it looks just like that actual landscape, but it's made out of garbage. And so he opened up the reverse side of the wall so that you could see that it's nothing but garbage materials, which kind of undermines the claim to representation that the actual painting has. But on the other hand, although almost all his characters are now reproduced digitally, Schubing insists that they should start out as hand-painted forms. He also insists that although they're not legible, they nonetheless look Chinese. Their form itself is inherently Chinese. So on the one hand, his characters aren't really ideograms. There's no claim to referentiality or indexicality, and it would be hard to call them signs at all. But on the other hand, they actually are not meaningful, but they're more than stable signs. They're emanations of reality, not just arbitrary. They're Chinese, among other things. The very hand-painted form of a character speaks both to its Chineseness, and he sometimes says to the idea of an ideogram with an indexical tie to the real. So for instance, the character for river looks like a river and carries the imprint of a human hand. Clearly, there's a tension of apparent opposites in all of this, between an almost non-human sign, devoid of culture, stable linguistic reference, or bodily origins, and a kind of sign that's grounded in a cultural humanity that seems to be essentialized by the human body itself. Schubing then pushes these tensions in his most recent work, and I just will end with two quick examples. First, he recently has turned to icons and emoji as the basis of a new kind of writing. He's used these to write whole books that in principle could be read by someone, almost anyone, who didn't know even any language at all. That's his claim. This too is an attempt to create a new kind of universal, or at least a universal language, one that could be transparently read by anyone, regardless of what traditional language they spoke, a kind of language that transcends languages. It's perhaps still somehow a human language founded on emotion, but in this case, it's not a Lacanian language. There is apparently no symbolic law of the father needed to guarantee a fixed set of meanings. Somehow there is the implication that art and writing have self-producing, signifying functions. My last example is perhaps Schubing's most ambitious, involves sending a satellite into orbit in outer space. This is hugely expensive. Obviously, he has governmental support to do this. And he emphasizes that he sends it out beyond the Kármán line demarcating the Earth's atmosphere and gravitational force. The satellite beams images onto a screen that is then recorded by a cell phone, which beams those images down to us. And this is still going on. So again, we're being placed in a new kind of universalized landscape position in which we can see the globe from outer space, but while we're still down on Earth. And the images that are generated by a computer program on the satellite consist of one of Schubing's generic emoji figures, who is walking along holding a bag, and spilling out of the bag are random letters from random writing systems, now just falling out and not forming into words or statements. That's what we see and are meant to identify with an emoji figure with non-referential language bits. This does hint at a new kind of open universalism. Schubing tells us that we might not only find ourselves from a position above the Earth, but also beyond any sense of a divide between the Earth's atmosphere and outer space. Art beyond the Kármán line, he calls it, and beyond linguistic divides. The animated emoji figure, too, is totally generic, but in a way that any of us, whatever color, gender, etc., any of us might identify with it. But one more thing, as the satellite passes over different countries on Earth, the lettering that spills out of the bag actually changes form according to the culture of the country that the satellite is flying over. So the reference to human geographies actually does remain, to some extent, with writing in its very material form as the basis for this. In sum, you could think of this as a position of agency and freedom. Anyone could apparently identify with this position, and that person is themselves then as generically open to a new kind of universal as a computer-generated emoji figure, running along beyond the gravity of our Earth. To me, this seems to be a desire for transcendence of the most basic terms and categories of modern life in basic material ways, all mediated through language. There's an optimism and even an insistence that we can somehow formulate and see the rules of the world in a new way, that it might take us beyond our given selves. But it's also worth keeping in mind that it's potentially also meant to be a new, specifically Chinese universal. Or more basically, and I can go into that, but maybe not. Or more basically, throughout, we can see an almost radical demand for a new, better world, and yet there's still an acknowledgement of, and even a love for, the whole geography of language and culture and nation as we know it. There's a hope for a new universal, maybe with hints of a new kind of singularity. There's at least a dream of freedom from the given laws that seem to be at the foundation of the world that we've known. Vortexes are perhaps more important than gravity now. And yet an acknowledgement that those laws remain structured into the materials landscape that we still have.
Thank you, Tom. Thank you. A really great paper to open up our session, I think, to take us to a whole lot of questions around AI language and the posthuman, the way in which language is, moving beyond our sphere of communication and moving into other ways of thinking about the world. We'll hear from our second speaker now, who's coming in on Zoom. So I'd like to welcome Jonathan E. Abel. Please, Jonathan, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I just want to confirm that I'm sharing my screen and you can see it, I hope.
Yes, that's correct. Yeah.
Great. Well, I just want to thank the CUNY Center for the Humanities, the Graduate Center, the Art Science Connect, and the conference organizers, Helen, Cole, and Peter. And I also want to thank Tom for inviting me to do this. My paper's going to take kind of two forms that I hope are there's a spelling error there. It says should be two modes. As you can see, I've been putting this together pretty quickly, editing it down from a much longer kind of mess of a piece for today's conversation. So I'm going to be talking about basically AI exchange in two modes. The first mode is thinking through AI through the lens of the thinker Karatani Kojin, who's a philosopher, but also a literary scholar in Japan, and who recently made the argument that the end of literature has come. And I'll talk a little bit about what that means. And when I say recently, this was back in 2004, so before AI. And also, I'm going to be relating AI language production and circulation through the lens of glitch poetics. So part one is this first mode of exchange. This paper examines the degree to which Karatani Kojin's thinking about what he calls an exchange mode D, the reciprocal mode of social interaction to come, and his theorizations about the end of literature. So the degree to which these two things coincide to predict or anticipate or explain the appearance not only of AI, but of AI cultural products, such as Kudan Rie's Akutagawa Prize-winning novel, Tokyo City Sympathy Tower, that was written in part by ChatGPT. You may have heard about this. It was kind of a global news story when the author revealed that part of the novel was written in ChatGPT. At first glance, exchange mode D, theorized in Power and Modes of Exchange. This is Karatani's most recent book. Reads to some as a utopian longing for an end or outside to capitalism. It seems as if in total isolation, though, on the other hand, from his early 21st century musings on the end of literature. Yet the two theorizations share much in common. Notably, Karatani notes that literature has passed its efficacy as a prime mover of radical ideological potential, and he admits that other cultural products may take over such social and political tasks and functions where modern literature left off, thus leaving a space open for new modes of cultural exchange, such as those cultures that were beginning to flourish on the internet at the time of his end of literature essay. Though social media and AI go unmentioned in his essay, it's clear, whether from the Arab Spring, Brexit, or the elections of Barack Obama or Donald Trump, or the more recent disruptions of the workplace and university around AI since the time of his essays, that these technologies have had both integrative and disintegrative social roles that literature once possessed, according to Karatani. The question of whether such modes of internet exchange, whether for finding a community to address real world needs or for building community through trolling, fake news, and hallucinations, represent the kind of step forward in exchange out of capitalism, which is exchange mode C, or steps backwards, whether they themselves are caught in the platform economies of social media corporations, which is exchange mode C or capitalism, or the arenas of new nationalisms, which is exchange mode B, the self-sacrifice of the individual for the social group, or old school tribalisms, which is exchange mode A, the barter or gift exchange mode. This differs from many of the bubbled cultures of social media, recent digital literature stemming from the participatory cultures of social media exchange on the internet and generative cultures of AI seem to present examples of exchange that touch on all four modes of exchange theorized by Karatani. But they may also represent the new origins for cultural meaning making that Karatani leaves open in his work. So that's my sort of basic argument. If the literary or radical edge when subjectivity and the critique of subjection co-occur, that is, if literature's possible political potential lies in the fact that it is both a conveyor of ideology as well as its undoing, then to some degree, a novel such as Kudan Rie's ought to have had that ability. Tokyo City Sympathy Tower, or Tokyo Metro Sympathy Tower, it's sometimes translated as, is right not only in thinking or critiquing the very terms and ontologies with which we label or categorize our world, but also critiquing tolerant societies that understand the systemic causes of crime. Kudan's novel pivots around a parallel between language and architecture. On the one hand, we have an equivalence being drawn between the loss of meaning in language that is signaled as occurring somewhere between the ideology of political correctness or wokeness and the technologies of large language models and generative AI. And on the other hand, we have an equivalence being drawn between language and the policies of criminal punishment and rehabilitation. The novel stages crime and punishment in a society that understands the responsibility for all crime to some extent to lie beyond the individual actor. In the novel, those formerly called criminals are now rebranded as Homo Miserables and can now all be housed in a new prison house of the future, except they won't call it a prison, they'll call it the Tokyo City Sympathy Tower, which is a state-of-the-art facility that's comfortable and reads a lot like a beautiful apartment building. Here, the hero of the novel is incontrovertibly the architect of the tower, who, though doubting herself, seems unironically the creator of a new Tower of Babel. And we get a sense of this linguistic shift and its relation to architecture from the very first paragraph. Here, the function, or rather dysfunction, of language in contemporary society is precisely that which puts us into our own individual realms or bubbles of soliloquy. You can think about social media bubbles in their most extreme form. The metaphor between language and architecture continues throughout the novel. The novel speaks of a tension between this idea that the world informs language, or rather, does the language build the world? So that tension between these kind of two statements is what the book is interrogating again and again. Ultimately, though, it seems that the book is arguing that that language takes precedence. And in passage after passage, we're giving displays of a kind of rage against how language evolves for the needs of a caring society. So it's sort of a rage against wokeism. And we have these kind of long tirades about this. So one, I could suppose, take all of these tirades as a kind of mocking or prevalent attack on wokeness, cancel culture, and PC sensibilities. That is, it could be sending these up, that it could be making fun of such attacks. But the incessance of the rage, the fact that we're not really given an alternative to this rage. For instance, we never get the argument that words matter, that microaggressions pile up to systemic violence, or that intersubjective reality to some degree is equal to objective reality. So the fact that we're never given these other plausible views makes it start to seem like that's all there is to the book, that there is no radical potential there, that the modern literature as a mover and shaker of ideology is truly dead or come to an end, as Karatani would have it, that we've sort of hit the limits of the human there. But then there's also this entire discourse about how the protagonist, this architect herself, was raped, but no one believed that it was a rape, because the man, because she knew the man and invited him into her apartment. So again and again, the words in the world of the novel do not attach to the things that they're supposed to signify. We're told that how anyone who has been raped should reject the Tokyo Sympathy Tower as a kind of decent construct, because it is sympathetic towards the criminals, because it removes the individual responsibility in a chasing of kind of social justice. So the idea is that we need to be sympathetic to criminals. We rename them as a different form of human, a human homo miserabilis, and therefore they are the result of a systemic cause, and therefore not solely responsible for their crimes in the novel. The difficulty of calling a criminal, a rapist, a prison is what the book laments again and again. And yet in doing so, it denies the fact that in literature, there should be both, on the one hand, the power to name a thing as it is, and on the other, simultaneously, the power to speak metaphorically, the power to rename, the power of allegoresis, the power of metaphor. So the book flirts with both of these, but it rests on moments when the two collapse into one. And these moments are the moments of AI confrontation. We know at a meta level that Kudan talked with AI about her ideas, and indeed the name of the Tokyo City Sympathy Tower came from a discussion where she's asking it to give a renewal word for prison, and that's how she developed the title for that. But there are also these moments where Sarah, the architect, confronts an AI. The AI here is called AI built, but we know because Kudan has admitted this, that these sections are verbatim quotations from her dialogues with ChatGPT. So I want to now shift to the second part of my talk, and I want to spend the second and final part of this talk with this vision of the architect accusing AI of being illiterate, because in the context of a book that sustained even more recognition than the fame conveyed by winning the Akutagawa Prize, after it was revealed that it was in part written by AI. I want to suggest that it is perhaps the start of something else, or a confirmation of something else that had already started, a kind of post-human mode of, if not literary production, at least this kind of radical potential that Karatani is sort of dreaming of. A new mode of sociocultural exchange that indeed carries the radical potential to both conform to and critique the social norm, one not quite literary, but also not literary, at least not in the way that the press covered it as being new, but after the release of the AI. But I want to say that this exchange does represent something new. And maybe this was the result of the inclusion of these AI passages. So there's something deeply inexchangeable or unreciprocal about the exchange between not just the architect within the novel and the AI, but also Kudan Rie and ChatGPT. And we get this from the very first page before the novel actually begins with this kind of standard disclaimer. Here, the standard warning that might protect the copyright of the author and publisher, we find the very basis for the exchange is nullified. It appears particularly in this clause about a third party. Nothing can be transferred to a third party. Whether the owner of the book can copy in whole or in part for themselves is murky. But what is clear is that such copying and exchange with or without compensation is forbidden with a third party. But if there's a murky or implicit impossibility of copying for the self, what mode of exchange would that be? Nothing is transferred, nothing exchanged, or at least there's a closed loop of exchange and energy conserved, not if we think about the energy that is actually powering these things, like in my backyard where they're talking about starting up a nuclear facility to run AI, and particularly ChatGPT, because it's Microsoft doing that. But energy is conserved in this kind of closed loop discussion. Nothing is in actual circulation. The medium of what such exchange might be is murky, and yet what is an AI exchange if not something between exchange with oneself and exchange with a third party? So I would argue that Lauren Berlant, in her seminal article, The Commons Infrastructures for Troubling Times, laid out a convincing path for us to try to understand this relationship. There and elsewhere, Berlant discusses how glitches in infrastructure can allow for productive interventions through the commons to move towards reparative strategies. Glitches always exist, but they expose the faults in the system and provide openings for change. And with AI, we have a technology that is once infrastructure, as well as a commons that is necessarily replete with glitches. The main glitch, of course, is the fact that AI is a mirror of intersubjective reality, not objective reality. That is, generative AI mimics language or art, or photographs, which are themselves reflections of the world without ever testing itself against objective reality. But let me dwell on the glitch before I get into the nature of AI glitches like hallucinations. There's also an artistic function of the glitch that's been more recently considered integral to what Nathan Jones calls a glitch poetics within glitch art, mostly digital art that foregrounds the glitch. And that is the aesthetics of a kind of glitch realism. This is a way of saying that the more our daily lives are caught up in digital cultures and communications, email, social media, photography, video, the more art that conveys some of the glitches associated with those media seem real. This indeed is what we have in Kudan's novel. The very moment that we know Kudan used ChatGPT verbatim in the novel is the moment when the architect talks with the AI. Here she accuses it of being illiterate, and it responds, "I'm not illiterate," and sort of says, furthermore, you shouldn't use such hurtful language. The response of AI here is not so much an hallucination as a different kind of glitch, one that exposes the limitations and structure of the system. It will not allow for this kind of overt derogatory name calling. It is anti-bullying. It is the very kind of speech Kudan and her main character, Machina, are at work to expose as less than human, false, fake, overly PC, or woke. It is the very moment that AI mimics human speech at its most formulaic. And this is one of the points where I think AI is an agent that's working on us. When we play with AI enough, right, it makes you start speaking differently and often in more formulaic ways to get the results you want. Okay, so let me return to have a look at what fiction writers have said about AI, these AI glitches. When authors that use AI are asked about what they think about AI's potential for creating fiction, they have interesting answers. In an interview with the New Yorker, Sheila Heti, the author of According to Alice, basically said, it's not fiction, it's not fact, my story that I wrote along with AI, but it's all hallucination all the way down. And that's the most interesting bit. So for the novelist, hallucinations are not just glitches that are random or stochastic anomalies that are a small part of the system. Rather, they are precisely what is to be desired and to be encouraged and cajoled from the system. They are the best bits, the most useful ones for fiction. Kudan Rie has a kind of different view on this. For her part, she said in an interview with the Yomiuri Shimbun, the Yomiuri newspaper, that that AI's language is not offensive to anyone, and most people will find the answer acceptable. That is, the response acceptable. Pure literature, on the other hand, is about language art, in which you, like an individual, create something, even if it's unpleasant to write about. Here, Kudan is interested precisely in the inverse of what we tend to think of as the hallucination, that is the statistical anomaly. She's interested in AI as the statistical norm, the mainstream of what AI generates, the most likely. To her eye, there is an overlap in the baseline normal and the politics of political correctness. For her, the very success of ChatGPT and its ability to speak the statistical norm is the glitch to be exposed, not the hallucinations. But going back to Berlant and Jones and the glitch now as a way of conclusion, we can see that Kudan's use is clearly in the mode of glitch realism. That is to say, the very moment when the architect is talking to AI, that's when we get the actual quote verbatim dropped into the novel of the moment. And this is supposed to be a moment of the reality of the oddity or defamiliarization of the digital mediation as the very material for verisimilitude. But at the same time, we find, thinking through Hetty's comment, the idea that the hallucination glitch is precisely what is important or interesting about AI, the best bit. Then we can go back to Berlant's notion that the glitch provides an opening for interaction or change within the commons. This may explain why AI exchange or use of AI was not opposed by the Akutagawa Prize Board, not why the press felt it was interesting. That is, they thought it was buzzworthy just because it used AI. But I think it's this reason that the literary experts on the panel were okay with the usage. It's precisely the fact that AI was used, dropped in, that subverts, I would argue, going back to the disclaimer at the beginning, a kind of capitalist understanding of the production of literature, because we know this very text had to already violate any copyright claim that ChatGPT had over the text in order to be published and in our hands as a novel. So that very first thing is a sort of a lie, that very first disclaimer. And I guess that's where I ended because I'm out of time. Thanks.
Thank you, Jonathan. Well, thank you very much for that presentation. You've really given us a lot of ideas to think about, and I think we'll return to them in the discussion. But it's set me off on thinking about a lot of different issues. But we'll hear from our third speaker now, who is Nick Montfort.
Thanks to Helen for running this, and thanks to Tom for the invitation to the panel and Peter for moderating. I greatly appreciate being included. This is a topic of central interest to me, and I'll be speaking about AI in scare quotes and language in the context of the work that I've been doing with Liliana von Bertram over the past several years to develop this anthology output, an anthology of computer-generated text, 1953 to 2023. One of the things you may note about this timeline, if you're familiar with the term artificial intelligence emerging, it was in 1956 at the Dartmouth Summer Institute that happened, but the first computer text generation was, in fact, unquestionably in 1953 when Christopher Strachey did this on the Manchester Mark I, so it predates at least the specific term AI. So I'll speak about AI with, of course, a focus on language and text more specifically. Artificial intelligence nowadays means to most people large language models with certain tweaks, reinforcement learning done through human feedback, instruct levels to it. But LLMs are what people mostly think of now, of course, since AI was around and named since 1956. That's not all it is. LLMs are essentially probability distributions over sequences of words. I really like what Robin Zabrowski has described about them. The only truly linguistic things we've ever encountered are things that have minds. And so when we encounter something that looks like it's doing language the way we do language, all of our priors get pulled in and we think, oh, this is clearly a minded thing. But in fact, there's no intelligence to LLMs. They're probability distributions over sequences of words. They are language generators, certainly, but not intelligent. And furthermore, we think about the artificiality of them. When we open up a calculator application and start doing arithmetic on our computer, is that artificial arithmetic? Or is it actually arithmetic that our computer's doing? It seems to me that it's not artificial, so there's no reason that probability distributions over sequences of words generated by computer, as opposed to some other means, would be artificial. So this is neither artificial nor intelligence. What they certainly are, the current things that we talk about, they are large language models, except in a narrow sense of language, because language, as Tom reminded us, with the remap piece that was shown in the Japan Pavilion, is at least speech, gesture, and text, which would include handwriting, print, electronic text, and so forth. But there's no speech or gesture except for perhaps transcribed speech being a small part of what we find in these large language models. So they're actually large text models, so a narrower thing than is being claimed. So large text models. Now, despite my winnowing down of what AI is, they're nevertheless admittedly very significant systems, I think. The transformer architecture plus massive textual data has created uncannily cohesive, not coherent, not semantically coherent, but hanging together syntactically in uncanny ways, results. But they're certainly not the only AI-like systems, not the things that have been called AI or characterized as AI over the years. I would simply call them computer-generated text. And I think that there's a lot of stuff that's computer-generated text. And computer-generated text itself is a very significant and major text technology, like the printing press, the typewriter, word processing, the internet, email, the web, web search. If we didn't have search, the web would not be very handy. Wikipedia, social media. These all caused great upheavals, consternation. People were really worried about how, for instance, you would still be able to assign papers to college students after Wikipedia came out, right? A concern that we still have with large language models today. It turns out that we've lived through all of these things, and I have a little typographical mark next to social media because maybe we haven't lived through social media yet, but the other ones we have. Computer-generated text includes not just LLMs, but three-stage pipeline generation, combinatorial text generators, cognitive models of storytelling, computational creativity systems, conversational systems, text and image systems, a lot of stuff. And we are trying to showcase this and provide a context, I would say a historical context, but it runs up through the present. It's a current history in Output, an anthology of computer-generated text, 1953 to 2023, which I edited with award-winning poet Lillian Von Bertram, who is on the faculty at the University of Maryland and directs the MFA in creative writing there. It's coming in a week, November 5th. That's going to be a momentous day. From MIT Press and Counterpath, it includes 7 decades of computer-generated text. The focus is on English. We have a few things that were already translated that are in there, but we didn't commission translations for the work. And it's about output, as the title says. So not about human-computer collaboration, although that's also a significant practice nowadays. It's in all genres, not only poetry, literature, or creative work. So for instance, I'm not expecting that people will scan this and read every bit of the contents, but the contents are divided by fine-grained genre. Conversations, beginning with Eliza, a few examples of humor generation, letter generation, not the orthographic symbol, but correspondence. Novels, performance. There's a large section of poetry with subsections of haiku, sonnets, and visual poetry. Prose, which is a sort of catch-all category. Reporting, which I'll say more about in a moment. Rhetoric, oratory, and lectures. Sentences, storytelling, text and image, tweets and microblogging, and word generation. And the timeline, as you can see, does start in 1953. There's only 2 examples from the 1950s, but things get busier soon afterwards. Now, a lot of people reading the news and learning about this recently thought the beginning of computer-generated text was in 2019 when GPT-2 was announced by OpenAI. And the response to this prompt in a shocking finding, scientists discovered a herd of unicorns living in a remote, previously unexplored valley in the Andes Mountains. Even more surprising to the researchers was the fact that the unicorns spoke perfect English. We talk about the cultural biases inherent in this and so forth. But that after 10 tries, what we got as a completion was something, again, amazingly cohesive. And OpenAI said, we're not able to release the full model. It's too dangerous to share. So this was all over the news, as you can see. What was too dangerous? Let's take a quick look and actually read the text. The scientists named the population after their distinctive horn, Ovid's unicorn. These 4-horned silver-white unicorns. And wait a moment, I thought that unicorns had 1 horn. So there in the second sentence, in the lead paragraph of this work, is a what we would just consider a contradiction. It's something that's incoherent. And later on, we see that Dr. Perez says these creatures could be seen from the air. They were so close they could touch their horns. It must have had a pretty good helicopter pilot, I would say, if this was the case, right? So there's a lot of these things in the text that even after 10 tries of trying to put this model together, it's a little questionable. Now, if we go back, on the other hand, to 1974 and see what Anthony Davey presented in a dissertation project, the system Proteus would report on a game of what he would have called noughts and crosses, what we call tic-tac-toe, and provide what I think of as a textualization, a way to render underlying data textually. So I won't read this, but instead of fake news generation, we have real reportage, real generation of text going back to 1974. Another example, Mumble in 1980, provides a textualization of the proof of Russell's paradox, and specifically the Barber paradox here. Kathy McCowan in the system Text from 1985 looks at the Office of Naval Research database and provides English language access to the relationships that are modeled in that database. So there's a long history of computer-generated text that's giving us real news. Here's weather forecasting, which was released bilingually in French and English as a commercial product later on. And so this is something that was, that again, along with earthquake reporting, sports, finance, is an example of work that's employed and useful in robo-journalism and has been for decades. Now, I want to mention something maybe more relevant to current events. Edward Hovey's system Pauline from 1987, which was specifically created to produce different sorts of slants on the same news story. So to provide different rhetorical positions. So here, I'm going to read this basic news story. Yale University punished a number of students for building a shantytown on Beinecke Plaza by arresting 76 students and tearing it down one morning in early April. The students wanted Yale to divest from companies doing business in South Africa. Finally, the university caved in and allowed the students to rebuild it. So this is based on an underlying model, and everything that it says is factual. But the system is able to present this news story, the facts behind it, in different ways, depending upon the views of the speaker and the imagined audience. This is a more detailed and news-like journalistic style presentation, which tells you that the shantytown's destruction happened at 5:30 a.m. And who it was in the community who expressed criticism of Yale's action, that Yale announced a commission that would go to South Africa. Here's another version of this. And here is a version in which we see a little less sympathy toward the students. Yale requested that the students erect it elsewhere, but they refused to leave. The university intended to be reasonable. The university gave it permission to exist until the meeting of the Yale Corporation, but even after that, the students still refused to move. At 5:30 a.m. on April 14th, officials had to disassemble the shantytown. There we go, they had to. But actually, all the information here is factually true. Here's one. I am angry about Yale's actions. The university had officials destroy a shantytown at 5:30 a.m. on April 14th. A lot of concerned students built it in early April. Not only did Yale have officials destroy it, but the police arrested 76 students. After the local community's huge outcry, the university allowed the students to put the shantytown up there again. And a final one. It pisses me off that a few shiftless students were out to make trouble on Beinecke Plaza one day. They built a shantytown, Winnie Mandela City, because they wanted Yale University to pull their money out of companies with business in South Africa. I am happy that officials removed the shantytown one morning. Finally, Yale gave in and let the shitheads put it up again. So all of this generated from the same underlying representation of events that happened, but with different rhetorical perspectives back in 1987. We had real news generation, real rhetoric going on in the 70s and 80s. So I think if the fake news generation is of interest to us today, it exists in a history that's worth knowing, not only a history of real news generation, many sorts of text generation. It's a global history. Even if we look only at English computer-generated text, we see that it's happened in England, in New York, Massachusetts, in Mexico City. And we also include in the anthology some examples from Germany and Italy in the early years. So this is Christopher Strachey's love letters from 1953, signed MUC, Manchester University Computer. We can actually, even though we look at these as sort of frivolous, he did publish about them in Encounter, a CIA-funded art magazine. We can think about them various ways. You know, historically, people have paid more literate people to write love letters on their behalf, including like during World War II, right back to your sweetheart. This could be a computer taking over a human's job, actually, right here, automating something. Could be making fun of phatic and semantically empty writing. I think it's certainly that. Could be showing that letters are based on schema. They have openings, closings. Could be making fun of heterosexual rituals, given Christopher Strachey's sexuality. Here's some output from Otto Beatnik from 1961, which was published in some major magazines. Which was supposed to imitate beat poetry for some reason. How is insect? It's not even grammatically correct. It's not, in my view, it seems unrelated to the work of the beat poets, but it was seized on anyway because of the excitement about the possibility of computers generating poetry. And there is some unusual turns of phrase that one might not find in human written writing, but I'm not sure that the connection to beat poetry. Joseph Grimes in Mexico City in 1963, studying indigenous languages there, created a very early story generator, and it embodied a sort of Propian, Campbellian idea of hero and villain, Here's Campbell with one of his ethno-linguistic anthropological subjects speaking with him and trying to find out if, under different conditions of pronominalization and relationship of naming someone as hero or naming someone as villain, if the story would be more easily understood. Joseph Weizenbaum developing ELIZA in the mid-1960s is a major milestone in chatbots and in text generation. The first computer character, among other things, although Weizenbaum himself didn't position it that way. No doubt a parody of psychoanalysis. This is only one of several ELIZA scripts, as will be discussed in great detail in a forthcoming book about ELIZA that the MIT Press is going to be publishing. And eventually this led a decade later to Weizenbaum's repudiation of AI in 1976, Computer Powers and Human Reason. And then here in town, downtown, Allison Knowles and James Tinney developed The House of Dust, a poem that is endless, global, inclusive, including specificities, ambiguities, has wide variation in some lines, repetition in others, and randomness and regularity. And I hope that several of you, many of you, were able to see the brilliant exhibit here at the CUNY Grad Center of the project that stemmed from this computer-generated poem developed in Fortran originally. So lots of stuff in the 50s and 60s already happening in computer-generated text around the world in different contexts. A lot of it not being done, of course, by computational linguists or computer scientists, but by people from other perspectives. 1973, I just want to highlight a few things. 1973 was a good year for computer-generated poetry. Here I find in this book, 101 Basic Computer Games, a program called Poet. All the code is included. The author of whom is unknown. Already you have the basic programming language was just invented in the mid-1960s at Dartmouth, but there's already basic programs in 1973 where we're like, yeah, we don't know who wrote this. But here it is. We put this in a book, and it produces a cento, a pastiche, a cut-up of The Raven. Here, haiku are like trolleys. By Robert Gaskins. This is, these I think are reasonably good haiku for, being more or less the first ones, like within 4 years of the first computer haiku at all. And Robert Gaskins is also an interesting figure because he went on to develop PowerPoint. This is Margaret Masterman's selection of haiku, a different perspective from the same year, 1973. And I want to actually read some examples here of these little-known creative generation systems from the late 80s. This is work that was published in the Los Angeles Times, RIP, and Scientific American. So this is Rosemary West's work from 1988. As you keep spilling things on yourself, we discuss the possibility of revolution. No one is affected by celestial music. And someone asks that I've learned to love myself. The disco dancers who never eat pork still expect to be paid. They don't care about your opinion. And without hesitation, you think about giving up. And the real story is that your secret has been sold. And then Bonnie, yeah. I won't read from Mel, but I want to flash this on the screen, another extraordinary text from 1989. Storytelling systems of the 90s include Daydreamer with a cognitive model of daydreaming, Taylor based on a simple system based on planning, and Grandmother, which weaves together two different storytelling models. There's in the 2000s systems that appropriate from the web. National Novel Generation Month, starting in 2013, which I wouldn't say is actually about making novels, created, for instance, a book of sonnets, Ranjit Bhatnagar's project. He's a local sound, textile, and computational artist. He pieced these together computationally from what was then Twitter. And this is a work of mine that was done for NanoGenmo of a very different sort of attitude, Hard West Turn, which is about gun violence in the United States. I'm at the end of my time, so I just want to note that the global history of text generation continues, not always using LLMs. I edit a series called Using Electricity, a book series from Counterpath. Publishers like Antiism in Montreal are producing computer-generated work. There's online journals. I know we'll hear about one from Kyle and Katie, and other small press publishing exhibitions, one-off projects, and people who are focusing their literary practices now on being author programmers and on doing text generation. And that's different even than the remarkable things that we saw in the 1960s. All right, thanks very much.
So we'll take just a couple of minutes for questions, I think, if we wouldn't mind. But we heard from Tom about text and visuality and the question of universality, language models as cultural modes, and planetary and interplanetary perspectives. John brought us to the modes of exchange, and I think that that's one of the really crucial points that we're going to talk about today. The end of literature and Karatani Korjin's musing on the new forms of language and new forms of subjectivity and possibly new forms of capitalism and so on, and the possibility of glitches. And I think the glitches sort of reappeared in your presentation because you took us to the sort of prehistory of the internet and the constant presence of glitches and kind of misperformances. And I was really reminded of the fact that when ChatGTP was launched, everybody wanted it to do Shakespeare, and so why was it Shakespeare that was always being asked to sort of be reproduced? There was a lovely piece where somebody asked ChatGTP to write a song in the style of Nick Cave, and Nick Cave came on and chipped in, and he said, "It's nothing like what I write." So, really interesting presentation there as well, and taking us to the poetic. So let's open it up to the floor. Please use the microphone because we are streaming. So would anybody like to begin with questions or comments or feedback?
It's just, if you had a question, Jonathan, go ahead.
Oh, I do. So I have a question both for Tom and for Nick. Tom, I was really interested in this idea of, you said it's language on its own, even if there's no human, that it's happening on its own. And to me, that doesn't quite seem right. And it kind of ringed with something that Nick said, which was that he was interested in these language generations that were not collaborative. And I want to know what not collaborative means there, because there's a human at some point in these systems, right? They're creating the systems, hitting run, whatever the point is. And so, like, where are we drawing the line of collaboration and agency here between the computer, and do you both have specific things in mind when you make these kinds of statements?
Yeah, so for me, good question. And to be clear, I don't really think that there's nobody or nothing behind that language or a large language model. Of course, there always is. In some ways, it's like cybernetics. There's always something outside the system helping it to starting it up and running it, et cetera. It's the idea. So for me, it's not ideology, but it's just the way people are starting to think of this as something fundamentally different. One of the claims for difference seems to look like something like, say, Shubing's idea that there's a standing point from which you could read this that is not ours, that is something other than human, right? And it's hard to know what that would be, but it always seems like somehow implicitly part of the interest, at least, is that claim that there is something other than us that is generating this. And that what that otherness is complicated and uncertain.
That's helpful.
Yeah, that's a very, I think that's a very rich and provocative answer. So having edited an anthology and figured, drawn boundaries of a certain sort and said, what will we include and what won't we include? For instance, will we include things that are done procedurally or algorithmically, but without the use of general purpose electronic computers? No, we didn't do that. How did we practically define what's a human computer collaboration and what is output? So we're not saying that computer programs don't have authors when we make that distinction, but what we're saying is that, like, for instance, let me speak from my own practice even before I speak as an editor. My goal when I do projects that involve computer-generated text is to embody as much of the authorial process as possible in a computer program that someone else could then, if they wanted to, study, modify, share, right? But if I were to use that as an intermediate phase in my process, which many, many people do, a prosthetic imagination or something that could be folded into poetry or fiction writing and so forth, that's fine. But for me, I would feel like I hadn't sufficiently embodied the writing process in that program, right? So, and I certainly claim authorship of the program. In fact, I have to claim authorship of it in order to obviate the copyright regime and make it available as free and open source software, which I do with my projects. So it's important to me that I am the author of the program, but I try to do that from that standpoint. So when we looked at what we would include in the anthology, we similarly thought, what is the output of a computer program rather than something that was developed with computational assistance or collaboration? And we hope there will be many, many more anthologies, perspectives. In fact, there's already a literary magazine that is about this, which we'll hear about in the third session, Ensemble Park. So there'll be more opportunities to learn about those collaborations, but that was our focus.
Thanks.
Well, there were two things that came to mind actually for me related to Tom's presentation. So one is there's an artistic duo called Switcheristic Telecommunications. These students who met at NYU Shanghai. And their most recent project just premiered a few days ago is something that generates classical Chinese poetry entirely with invented words. There are words that can be, and not with glyphs, but actually with spoken words, right? So it's you see the relationship to Zhu Bing's Book from the Sky and other projects, but it's not writing. It's not a writing system. It's about not having tones for certain words. Like what are the invalid tones? What are the tones that don't exist for this syllable? And let's make a poem entirely out of that.
Just to comment on that, it is really interesting thinking the difference between oral and written language once you hit AA, because how could you do that in written language? You couldn't in some ways. As soon as you wrote it out, it would become more specific. They wouldn't be invented words anymore, almost. Yeah. Especially with Chinese ideograms, which almost automatically give you a meaning in a word in themselves.
Yeah. So he's doing it in the Latin alphabet the two of these are doing it for humans to read but they're also getting tricking speech synthesis into doing this.
It's a great project.
So the other thing though is I'm interested in Zhu Bing's satellite project and the idea that language is somehow tied to geography, as if you could pour out the writing system that corresponds to a certain geographical region. Just thinking about, it's like when you see the political map of the United States and you're like, oh, the United States is all red. It's like, yes, if landmasses voted instead of people, that's true, right? But in this case, it's sort of like, well, when that satellite goes over New York City, what's it going to spill out? Because we've got, like Chinese, Japanese, French, Haitian Creole,
For sure.
Polish, Russian. I mean, there's sort of,
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
arguably, sure, you could say that cultures of languages are multiple even here within Manhattan, for sure.
Yeah.
So in some ways, partly what he's trying to get at, especially once you start to use this kind of emoji figure rather than an actual
Yeah.
human, is toying with the transcendence of language itself,
Mhm.
right? And so the idea that there are simply, say, American culture with American English
Yep.
is not really accurate either. But his simple point is that somehow we tie nation to culture, to language as a geography of the earth, and that somehow being in a satellite position would transcend all of that, and therefore, to some extent, language itself and the divisions that implies.
Thank you all for this. This is a question for Nick. I was really taken by the fact that you've done this very extensive anthropology of 1953 up until 2023. I'm a musician, composer, and so much of composition now is using really computer models that really generate data that we can then draw from that data. So before, when I was composing, before there were computers, I would try to create all sorts of gestural data points, and then I would draw from those to sort of refine them down to what I want to use into a composition. The same process goes on now, but I use the computer to just generate all sorts of data that maybe I wouldn't imagine. I mean, the first time I go to India, then I'm influenced by Indian music or Japanese music, so that becomes part of my data set that I can then draw from. The computer is basically generating large data sets of raw material that then gets synthesized through my sort of probability of priorities. So I was just thinking about an anthropology in the future where every composer that I know is generating this. You don't see that behind their piece. You just see a piece for orchestra. So is that a computer piece because it's generating that? Or is the idea of an anthropology a sort of anthology of trying to capture what is being used behind composition? Is that even relevant anymore when everybody is using it? Nothing has changed. I remember I was at a lecture recently by one of your colleagues, Heinrich Strobelt, who is part of the MIT IBM Watson lab, and he was saying that chemistry and physics really hasn't changed because of AI. It's just made it much faster, and you don't have to go through experiments to sort of figure out what doesn't work, because the AI can help you do that, which used to take years of trials. Now you can do that with that. So it hasn't really changed the essence of what the research is doing, but it's sped up the scale of what you can do faster. And it's sort of the same thing with a composer. I don't have to sit and generate raw material. The computer can do that for me, but still I'm creating what I think is original composition, even though what's behind it wouldn't be possible without that computer. And I'm just wondering whether an anthology is going to be able to capture what everybody is doing is different now, and it's not really about the computer anymore. It's about the process. That's a new tool, just like the piano used to be a tool.
Yeah, I mean, I think that is one perspective, is that, people like do exploration through computational means, which could be with an LLM, or it could simply be with a system, a very simple combinatorial computer program that one writes in, in the basic programming language, or nowadays in Python or something like this. And that those explorations then are used, as part of one's process. That's not the way I approach things. And it's also not the reason that I turn to computers to put words together. I would say it's, for me, it's until non-human voices wake us and we drown, really, that I'm interested in. I am looking for the computer to do something, not to pass as human, not to sound like a plausible, cohesive human voice, but in fact to sound uncanny. But to do so in a way that's resonant somehow with human experience. So there's so many different perspectives, though, that people have, and what we're trying to do is open up to those perspectives and allow readers to glimpse. We don't have source code in the book. It's, I mean, we could, but it's enough to show these excerpts as a way that even a general reader might learn a little bit about a huge variety of approaches that have been taken, including some that are exploratory as well as some that look to seek entirely novel directions.
ChatGPT to help me.
Okay.
I just have a genuine question about programs like Google Translate, and if any of you have looked into those types of algorithms and how they might dovetail with creativity.
Yeah, I mean, we have work in the anthology, and I have one project in the using electricity series that's done through Google Translate. So a lot of people have employed this, and in many ways. So I guess again, if you talking about my own sort of literary taste, often the approach is to use such a system to degrade language, and so. There could be a glitch poetics that tells you something about a system, but if it's simply, oh, I made language worse by putting it through this corporate technology that's supposed to be, that doesn't interest me so much. But Rina Masterson did a project, Experiment 116, taking a Shakespeare sonnet and going through every possible language to actually stake a claim for everyone's ability throughout the world, all speakers of English, whether they're speakers of basic English in Africa or use English as a means of business communication, but it's not a native or home language or anything, or they're immigrants who are learning English, that everyone is a valid owner of this language, in possession of this language. Everyone has as much a right to Shakespeare's sonnet as anyone else. So that type of project and that attitude toward Google Translate and using it in that context is one that interests me. And I'm sure it's not the only project, but that's an example of one that's represented in the anthology.
I think that's right. It speaks to the democratization and this comment earlier about everyone was interested in using Shakespeare. I think that comes from the idea that you give enough monkeys typewriters and one of them is going to type out Shakespeare. That there's a potential for a humbling effect of using AI, but also of what the human is. But also at the same time, this kind of defamiliarization. So. Yeah, I think that, and the universalization, right, and democratization of in the most utopian idea about what AI can bring, in terms of translation is access, right? So,
Time for one more question. Thank you.
Thank you. Hopefully it's not too vague, but I think what I'm thinking about, first of all, thank you for all the great context, really helpful. And I liked the Shubing work is really, I hadn't thought about it in that way, but this sort of impossibility of some of these translations that work brings up. And also looking forward to the book. That's awesome. And the semantics of that was really helpful. And it's having me think about, we're talking about like the correctness of it or the incorrectness or mistakes and errors and glitches. And I was thinking about how, because of how these data sets are built, even they are text and they only know this, like a map is not the territory kind of thing, right? It doesn't have the embodied knowledge. So you get those mistakes that you highlighted and we've all seen those. But humans, like the language itself is a coded system that we are using improperly all the time, or we struggle with as humans, and we are using it in all kinds of ways, and even bringing up people who are, like we're talking about English very specifically. So that's very, concerns me with so much of the data being, all of this system is being all in English and collected from English speaking, and how people use English, even if you're not a non-native speaker, like those errors are part of how we speak, rather than, I don't have another language for it. They're just how we speak, and I'm curious where that fits into these systems that you're building. Like the poetics of it, of glitch, I love, because now we're calling all of that stuff important. We're saying that's the sort of, feels like it's human because it's fanciful, right? But we use language in all kinds of ways. So I think that's what I'm kind of concerned about, is like naming it glitch, naming it error, when it's actually part of how humans use language.
Yeah, I think that, I mean, that was kind of what I was getting to, I guess, is that, you know, every system has a glitch. And in fact, the glitch is the thing that exposes the system. So the glitch is necessary to the system. So the glitch isn't really a glitch, right? It is the thing itself. And then that was sort of a moment of understanding for me. Oh, wow, I can finally see you guys. Hi. They just turned the camera on for me.
Yeah, I'll also mention, you know, there is a huge amount of work in other languages, some of which is represented in translation and anthology, but, you know, we already had a huge chunk of work before us just dealing with English. Probably, as far as we know, the first book that is a computer-generated book to be published was La Machine à Écrire by Jean Baudot. It's in French, and it wasn't published in France. It was published in Montreal, actually. And there's also, you know, the other early project from the 1950s is in German. It's quite a global enterprise. And we just didn't think that we were the ones to try to take on the entire world for the first project of this sort. And then, you know, there's like, I read Remap a little bit as a commentary on the Latin alphabet as an imposition upon global cultures of language. We even have, you know, Unicode is, which is the system by which characters like are, you know, encoded in all computing devices nowadays, phones, everything else, is in many ways an amazing utopian project to try to capture all contemporary and many historical writing systems. But at the same time, every character in that system has to have a description in English in the Latin alphabet. That's part of the Unicode standard, right? And it's, you know, by the companies who are part of it are based, you know, in the US. They're multinational companies. So there's a lot of complexities to language, and there's a high involvement of English in the Latin alphabet, you know, globally, no doubt.
Great. Well, we're at time now, I think. So, Helen, do you
We're
want
at
to say
time.
something?
So 5 minutes while we get ready for the next panel and deal with the next technology issues.
And
Talk amongst yourselves and obviously ask more questions with our panelists. People have been hanging around. There's still coffee, water, tea. Bathrooms are to your right. And the next panel is photography and AI manipulation.
and thank you to this panel. So a round of applause, please. Thank you.